In October 1973, the most powerful economy on Earth ran out of gas. Not metaphorically, literally. Gas stations across the United States shut their pumps on Sundays. Lines stretched around city blocks. Fistfights broke out at filling stations in New Jersey and Ohio. The President of the United States went on television and asked Americans to turn their thermostats down to 68 degrees. And within 14 months, the stock market had lost 45% of its value. But here's what no one talks about. This wasn't a surprise. It wasn't even new. Humans had lived through this exact collapse, the sudden end of the fuel everything depended on, at least a dozen times before. The names changed. The fuel changed. The collapse didn't. This is the story of what ancient humans did the last time the energy ran out, and what we forgot between then and 1973. The oldest economy on Earth. Go back 12,000 years to the Levant, the land corridor between the Mediterranean Sea and the Mesopotamian plain. Archaeologists excavating sites like Ain Ghazal in Jordan and the early settlements of the upper Euphrates have found something remarkable carved into the bedrock beside the first permanent human villages. Not temples, not graves, storage pits, sealed chambers of grain, dried fish, pressed olive oil, dating to at least 10,000 BCE. These are the oldest known acts of economic planning in human history, performed by people who had no writing, no government, no word for economy. And what they reveal is this. The first thing humans did when they had more than they needed was not spend it. It was hide it, bury it, protect it from the season that would inevitably arrive without rain, without harvest, without the river's yearly flood. The pit was not greed. It was memory, the memory of every winter that came early. But then, something changed, and that's where the real problem begins. When civilizations stopped saving. By the time the great empires arrived, the storage instinct had been replaced by something else entirely. The assumption that the supply was permanent. The Phoenicians discovered that the cedar forests of Lebanon were the most valuable timber in the ancient world. Dense, rot-resistant, tall enough to build ocean-going ships. So they logged them, systematically, for 5 centuries. By Roman times, the mountain slopes above Byblos and Tyre, once blanketed in cedar canopy dense enough to block the sun, had been reduced to remnant groves. The Epic of Gilgamesh had celebrated those forests as sacred, untouchable. The Phoenicians touched them anyway, and when the wood ran out, the fleets shrank, and the empire that depended on those fleets shrank with them. Here is the statistic that should stop you. Historians estimate that large-scale deforestation of the Levantine coast began as early as the 2nd millennium BCE. That means humans stripped their primary energy source, their fuel for ships, smelting, construction, warmth, in roughly 1,000 years. Sound familiar? The pattern repeated everywhere. Rome imported grain from North Africa until North Africa could not produce it. The Song dynasty of China burned coal industrially nearly 1,000 years before Europe and faced its own shortages, its own price shocks, its own winter when the city went cold. The Ottoman Empire's military power ran on the horse, and the horse ran on the grasslands of Anatolia. And when those grasslands degraded, the cavalry that had conquered a continent began to contract. Every civilization, the same arc. Find the fuel. Scale to the fuel. Forget the fuel has limits. Collapse when it ends. But one group of humans never made this mistake. And what they built instead is the most underrated survival system in history. What the steppe knew. The pastoral nomads of Central Asia, from the Scythians of the 7th century BCE to the Mongol confederacies of the 13th century CE, watched the agricultural civilizations around them build enormous cities, vast granaries, permanent stone roads, and they built none of it, not because they couldn't, because they understood something those civilizations didn't. Everything the steppe nomad owned could be loaded onto a horse in under an hour. The felt tent, the dried meat, the animals themselves, which were not just food, but currency. Not just currency, but a hedge. Because unlike grain stored in a pit, a living herd could walk away from a drought. Their wealth moved, which meant when the resource moved, they could move with it. Anthropologists studying mobile pastoralist cultures have noted a consistent pattern. They did not accumulate beyond what they could carry. The surplus was never stored in buildings. It walked. The agricultural empires called this poverty. The steppe peoples outlasted most of them. And then, in 1973, America discovered it had built the most immovable civilization in human history. The moment the spigot closed. October 17th, 1973, the Arab members of OPEC announced an oil embargo against the United States, effective immediately, in retaliation for American support of Israel in the Yom Kippur War. The price of a barrel of oil went from approximately $3 to over $11 in less than 3 months. That's a 267% increase in 90 days. What followed was not just an economic crisis, it was an infrastructure crisis. Because by 1973, American infrastructure had no fallback. The suburbs could not be walked. They had been designed around the car. The factories could not be cooled without electricity generated by oil. The food supply chain, by 1973 already deeply dependent on petrochemical fertilizers and diesel freight, could not reorient. Nixon asked Americans to lower their thermostats to 68 degrees. Congress imposed a national speed limit of 55 miles per hour. Gas stations closed on Sundays. Fistfights, lines, empty pumps wrapped in black plastic bags. The Dow Jones lost 45% of its value over the next 14 months. Behind that number were the pension funds and ordinary savings of workers in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland who had done exactly what they were told. Save, invest, trust the system. The system had been built on a price of oil that no longer existed. And here is what makes this worse. The geologist M. King Hubbert had predicted this in writing in 1956. Standing before the American Petroleum Institute, he presented the mathematics of finite reserves and told the room that U.S. domestic oil production would peak around 1970. It did, almost exactly on schedule. They largely dismissed him for 17 years. The lamp and the derrick. There's a small clay lamp in the collections of several Near Eastern museums. It is shaped like a pinched leaf, with a wick hole at the narrow end. It dates to roughly 3000 BCE. It burned olive oil, animal fat, or the crude seep oil that Mesopotamian peoples scooped from natural surface springs. The same molecule, the same ancient seabed, the same 300 million years of compression and chemistry. The Sumerians burned it in clay. The Texans pumped it through steel. The lamp and the derrick are the same gesture, the human hand reaching into the earth for light. What changed was not the molecule. What changed was the belief that the gesture could be repeated forever, at any scale, without cost. The lamplighter of 3000 BCE rationed the oil for a long night. They knew the vessel had a bottom. By 1972, that knowledge had been engineered out of daily life so completely that the average American had no physical experience of energy as a finite thing. You turned a dial. The heat came. You pressed a pedal. The car moved. The bill arrived once a month. And it was manageable. And it had always been manageable. And there was no reason to believe it would ever not be. That is not stupidity. That is what abundance does to memory. The 1973 crash did not begin in October of that year. It began in the moment a civilization decided that the corridor it was passing through was a permanent address. It began when the storage pit was replaced by the gas tank, filled weekly, never questioned. It began when Hubbert's mathematics were filed away and forgotten, because the alternative, believing him, would have required changing everything. The Neolithic farmer who buried grain in the bedrock of the Levant, the steppe nomad who kept his wealth alive and walking, the Phoenician shipbuilder who looked at a hillside of cedar and saw, for one generation, limitless material, and for the next generation, stumps. They all understood the same equation. Resources are not income. They are inventory. And inventory runs out. The clay lamp sits in its museum case, dark and small, older than any nation on earth. The hand that shaped it knew exactly what the earth would and would not give. It measured the oil before it lit the wick. Every age inherits that lesson. Most spend a generation forgetting it before they learn it again.